recording. Okay, hopefully we're recording now. Okay, so yeah, we're joined by Kara today, and Kara is a curator and researcher and holds a PhD from LSE. She's also a principal investigator on one of our Network Plus projects called Strategies for Safety and Solidarity, Understanding Protection Through Creativity in South Sudan and Colombia. So Kara's going to talk to us a little bit about visual policy briefs, and then we'll have some time for kind of questions and conversations later on. Yes, over to you, Kara.
Thank you so much, Louise, and thank you everyone for joining, and anyone who might be listening to this recording afterwards. I'm going to be talking about creative policy briefs from my point of view in the research that I've been doing on protection of artists and the work that I do in East and Southern Africa, and that I'm working on with our collaborators in Colombia. I have a short presentation that I'd like to go through, and then it would be interesting to open the floor and talk to some people in the room about particular policy ideas and recommendations that you might have coming out of your own work, and to be able to see if there's any creative approaches that we might be able to take. I've got one that I'm working on that I can help as a prompt in case you're thinking through what those might be. But I'd like this session to be useful for those on the call and listening to think about how you might implement something like this in your own work. So I'm going to start to share my screen with my PowerPoint here. Can everybody see that? Can you just give me an audible?
Yes, looks
yes.
good.
Okay, great. So
yes.
Fantastic. So I've already had a brief introduction. I work for the Frans Louwtje Institute for Africa, which is within the London School of Economics and Political Science. I do start every presentation and engagement with a positionality statement. I think positionality is essential in terms of understanding where the voice is coming from that's speaking to you, and what that means in the context of what we're going to discuss, but also in terms of policy briefings, which tend to sort of sterilize or remove that point of view. I think the positionality is also important from the creative perspective, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So in this photo, you see me sitting listening to Kusa Maski Gyal, an artist in residence that I worked with on a project called The Politics of Return, which was about what happens when people return from forced displacement. So that's me positioned in the listening point of view. But I'll also say that I identify as a white, hetero, educated Euro-American woman, and this creates a particular point of view based on those experiences. But my lived experience and my work experience in East and Southern Africa also shapes how I try to understand and approach these issues, and why the creative point of view and understanding creative knowledge registers is so essential. So why would we make creative policy briefs? What is the usefulness of the creative work that is important to articulate in something that might be quite technocratic in terms of recommendations? So the first point of departure on this is that in our case, for the project that we're doing with the Network Plus, and for the work that I do with artists, I believe that creative research deserves creative responses, that extracting the information about the creative point of view and sterilizing it into a narrative, long-winded report sort of segregates that knowledge register and doesn't recognize that aesthetics matter, and that the types of aesthetics that are used are really important for how people grasp information, but also what the detail is of the work that we're trying to do. And I think this is important because creative policy briefs are useful for more than just the creative industries. We see them cropping up in creative sector work, and particularly around creative industries and cultural policies. But what we're going to talk about today, and the work that we've been doing on unarmed civilian protection and humanitarianism, shows that they can actually be quite helpful for other industry point of view, other sorts of sectors that are not used to the creative approach. They're also really useful because they're a way to respond to what can be understood as an information overload. I'm sure anyone who's listening to this now has perhaps already experienced it in your day, where you've got emails flooding into an inbox, you've got long, detailed reports that your attention might struggle to get through, or dense material that's, say, in a different language to what you're used to, be that language between, say, Spanish or English, or a language in terms of a technical language or an academic language. And so the visual approach helps to make that information more digestible. And the research shows that people in policy points of view engage more with visual materials. And in the work that I've been doing, what I find is that people will actually pause with the visual and take more time to look at the image or the infographic, whereas the text-based material, people tend to scan through and try to create a rapid digestion of the information. I want to contextualize what we're talking about a little bit in terms of the creative policy briefs that we're developing for this project, which we have sort of rebranded. For our AHRC bid within the Network Plus, we called it Strategies for Safety and Solidarity. And that works very well for certain audiences. But as we developed the project, we found that it wasn't translating so well. So we have a working title of Art Allies that we have also created to sort of position ourselves in the collaborative and co-produced process. And so that's what I'm going to share a little bit with you, so that you get a sense for the types of outcomes that we might have in the research findings that we will translate into creative policy briefs. So we're asking some of the following questions. We're asking, how do artists seek safety in times of conflict and chronic insecurity? We're asking, how can conducting research within creative safe spaces inform how artists and allied activists experience vulnerability? And I'll just pause there to say that we use the term allied activists because we recognize that many artists who are in states of insecurity, who are in conditions of harm or threat, are part of social movements. And those social movements are connected to activism and different allyship. And what that does is allows us not to separate the artists as a specific segregated category, but to think about artists and allied activists as they do their socially and politically engaged work. And that informs our third research question, which is to ask, what forms of solidarity do artists and allied activists use to stay safe? So in light of some protection gaps that I'll explain in a moment, we want to look at solidarity in the everyday forms of protection that people are using. We're working in a South-South point of view, in which we're doing comparative work in Colombia and South Sudan with a visual artist in Colombia, Manuela Laura, and a theater collective called the Likikiri Collective in South Sudan. And the image that I've shared in this is courtesy of that collective, in which they are doing a community theater project on safety and security for residents there. So the kind of policy question that sits for me that I am trying to write a creative policy brief around now is a particular protection gap that artists and allied activists find themselves in which, in places of conflict and insecurity, artists find themselves not able to access adequate forms of protection. And that is in part because the Geneva Convention has been written in such a way that it protects predominantly tangible cultural property and protects property that is of the state and of the nation. And in places like South Sudan, which is a new nation that gained independence from Sudan in 2011, those lists of sites or details of cultural work have not yet been enshrined and are therefore not protected under those conventions, nor are the peacekeeping missions aware of what is needed to protect them. But what I'm sharing here is actually a move towards cultural rights and towards the recognition of cultural rights defenders that's trying to fill this gap. So thinking about the policy implications of our research is to inform this trajectory that is taking place and to think about what role artists and allied activists play as cultural rights defenders and how that feeds into a larger rights framework and how that framework can be informed for protection outcomes. So why do we use these creative methods when doing the research, and why will we use creative methods in designing and develop policy briefs? Partly because it's an important form of co-production and a way in which we can make things together. And it's a way in which we don't have to recognize just the academic or the organizational knowledge that is being collected, say through surveys or interviews, but recognizing the different type of knowledge registers that artistic works inform. And this can be done through visual analysis, through performative analysis, through processes of making work together. I myself am a curator, so I curate exhibitions as a research method, and working with different people to co-produce these forms of knowledge helps us to understand these protection issues and address the research question that we're trying to answer. But it's also a really valuable way to access difficult knowledge. And when I say difficult knowledge, I mean that knowledge that is embedded in politically unsettled areas, in insecure settings, but also about experiences that people may have had that could be traumatic, that could be sort of buried and difficult to articulate verbally. Working with creative methods allows us to access that knowledge. And in fact, a lot of creative co-production gain traction as a way to work with people around trauma healing and working with children and young people, because the language and the ability to verbalize in a narrative format was not easily accessible or even possible in some contexts. And I have shared this photo with you of Vergelina's pinhead, and she is one of women from Union de Costurera in Bogota, and doing tapestries as a particular way to gather together and to create knowledge around marginalized women's experiences, but also knowledge around representation and who is represented in the story of Colombia's conflict histories. So I'm going to shift us a little bit into a couple of slides to talk about the data. I've sort of grounded the point of view, talked a little bit about the work that we're doing in these different areas, and what comes from this is a particular set of data. So I'm going to start with sharing some reports from Free Muse that does an annual State of Artistic Freedom, just to give some examples of how they present the data, how that presentation changes, and what that means in a somewhat familiar but also creative presentation. So we've got there some stills from their 2020 report here. And you can see how the data has been aggregated into particular forms of harm and the way in which they have looked at detention, prosecution, and imprisonment as different violations of artistic freedom. But what's interesting about these data infographics is the way that they've brought in across them almost like a triptych of images and used the graffiti technique and aesthetic to really foreground two key symbols, one being art, so we know and understand them, and one being the X to signify a type of no-go zone or a difficulty. And so I thought that was an interesting example because it looks like many of the infographics that we might see in standard reports, but it has these tiny little conventions into them that brings forward the creativity. But that is coupled with something that might seem more similar to other graphic design layouts that we're used to in the reports that we read. So when it goes to actual harm, such as the number of people that have been killed, it becomes very specific, and the creativity comes away from that. And that is a particular decision that's being made to not essentialize the body in pain and the violence that has been committed. So when we're thinking about how we articulate these issues of protection and violence, it's also important to, as much as we want to be creative and perhaps playful in some of the design elements, to also recognize that certain components and certain harms should not be represented in a particular way and in a way that reproduces the violence. There's whole literature and legacy of the representation of bodies in pain, the representation of suffering, and the creative inclusion into the policy space should not be one in which we're trying to reproduce those. So now we're going to jump to some of the infographics that they've put in the last report, just so you can see a bit of shifting and changing in the way that they're visualizing their data. And these ones I actually think are really nice because they give a real span for the eye to go across. The other ones were quite linear and create a familiar form of infographic. Whereas these particular ones that I've shown here are using different types of shapes and different techniques. And what the visuality of that does is it carries your aesthetic across the space. So if you just take a moment to look across these, you'll realize that you're not necessarily reading it in a standard left to right, top to bottom, as one might do in an English language publication, but actually following the circular motion and being able to dart between, say, theater and literature in the art form suppressed, or looking at the higher number data of what's happening in Europe, or the darker crescents in some of the images. So now I'm going to talk about some quite impactful policy briefs that I have worked on, and ones that have informed the research that I'm doing for the network plus project, and a way in which we can use something that's quite familiar, like mapping, and work with artists, as well as to think about recommendations and how we might work with artists to create a creative policy brief that would take into account something that is embedded in almost all policy briefs, which are the recommendations. So this was a project that I did on temporary shelter and relocation in African countries with the Martin Roth initiative, which is part of the German Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And I did it working on areas in Africa, but also in tandem with another researcher, Lawrence Cuny, who is working in Latin American countries. And once I stop the presentation, I will share the different links to that research with everyone on the call. So I wanted to start by talking about this research with an image that we commissioned by Charity Atkunda. And you will see when you look at this image, it is a very powerful, very striking image that points to the issues and concerns that she has had when trying to gain access to different countries and get visas as a Ugandan artist who works freelance, who is not married, and who is subjected to visa regimes and consistently denied to be able to travel even when her artwork can. So if you look closely, you'll see that the different lines going across this self-portrait are in reference to different areas. The barcode speaks to the technocracy of what she has been subjected to, but also how that reality silences her and doesn't allow her to move and share her knowledge and her creativity with other places. And I use that kind of cover image to start, because I think when we're creating these types of briefs, it's important not to just co-opt artists or artwork as examples and illustrations of the work, but actually work from a creative point of view in which artists are helping to drive the messaging, and the work that you're doing around the recommendations are understood from their point of view. It doesn't mean that creative policy briefs can't exist without an artistic research point of view or artistic point of departure. But I think it's important that the creative understands the content or the context of which the recommendations are coming from. So even if the work that you're doing doesn't depart from something that's so embedded as the projects that I've described, in which I've worked with creative methods and collaborated with artists in co-producing, that working with artists who are embedded in those contexts is really important, and not hiring someone who might be closest to your UK university when you're talking about an issue that's far away, because that lens and that gaze and that point of view is so important. And I have been thinking a lot about work that I've done and connections to people in Sudan at the moment. So I wanted to also bring the work that colleagues and collaborators have done in the Sudanese revolution into this presentation and into this space, because of the real difficulty that they're facing now. And that's why I've shared the images from Fed Arts. But these are also artistic perspectives that informed the mapping, and whose processes of seeking safety during their performances in the revolution informed the mapping of safe spaces that I did for the Martin Roth initiative. So what came out of these has been the series of recommendations, and I have put them in their plain simple text-based form here for you to read through and to see what our outcomes were from speaking to artists and temporary shelter and relocation organizations, to arts organizations, to human rights defenders, to legislators, to policymakers, to government officials, to organizations working in the creative and diplomatic sector. And what we came out with was the insistence that we need to, from the point of view in Africa, recognize artistic freedom as its own space with its own unique needs, to offer direct applications from artists to programs. So what that meant is that artists are often required to go through different types of conduits to be able to apply for things, and have certain validation requirements on their risk and their threat that they're not able to achieve because of that filtration system. We wanted to have the support of full packages of shelter and relocation. So that means supporting people not just with accommodation and a flight, but also to support people to continue to create their own artwork. Or in the case of some people who would be separated from their family, to have that support to go with the family. And to link into existing types of residency and mobility programs that will allow artists to continue their work while they're in temporary or sometimes long-term exile. And to think about the sustainability of funding strategies, and then to link these into the existing migration and security situations, to work towards better digital connections and safety, and to keep expanding the networks and support systems. I won't read specifically through the recommendations in Latin America because that was Lawrence's research, but I thought it was nice to see the two side by side so that we would be able to think through them and to think about how those recommendations then translate into a creative point of view. So the two main creative outputs that we made from this research was a map, it's a mapping exercise, and an illustrated set of recommendations, which I'll show you on the next slide. So going back to the point about working with people in the areas where the issues are happening, we collaborated with an artist called Musa Mwisi, who created this map. And we went through a series of iterations to develop this map and to think about what the symbols are that go into them, how the different legends could speak to the different points of view, what the texture of the background in the areas would be, how the features of color would help to illustrate the points of shelter, the places of safety, or the absence of those in the area. So this is an important perspective that I take because I think when we see infographics and we see creative outputs from research, we don't always understand that there's negotiations into the micro aesthetics of what is going on here. So for example, you'll see in the bordering around the map itself, the geographic map, not the legend, this kind of microphone that comes out. And we thought about and decided to use that particular symbol for two reasons. One, because we wanted to recognize the voices of the artists who were in the research, who informed these points of view and who are affected by being forcibly displaced because of the political and socially engaged nature of their work, but also because musicians are one of the most threatened artists, and their art forms are ones that are often reach the biggest number of the largest amount of the population. Or in African countries, we've seen the leadership and even contests for presidencies being taken on by musicians and being met with harsh violence and recourse. So that's one example of how the aesthetics can be so important and vital to how you're communicating the information and the outcomes of what your research is trying to articulate. And then the legend, I mean, we spent actually quite a few days thinking about the different symbols and the different icons, and whether or not you use an icon that is legible from a Euro-American human rights international community point of view, or do you use a legend that is created by the artist, or do you use a legend that is, you know, more abstract? And these are really important decisions, and ones that are usefully navigated when you're working with people who understand the context, because then you can create the brief in such a way that it's translation between the information you're trying to impart, which in many cases for this work, as a commissioned work from the German Ministry of Foreign Affairs, was for a kind of a European policy point of view, but also using it as a departure point and resource for artists who might be seeking safety. And I can tell you that actually at the moment, with the new anti-homosexuality bill in Uganda, this resource is being used significantly and being circulated in a meaningful way for those artists who are queer and gay and in need of support. I'm going to take you to the last slide, which is a kind of, I guess it's the extreme end of what a creative policy brief might look like, in which we commissioned Ugandan artist Mirembe Musisi to visualize the recommendations, to think about how, when we understand the different types of recommendations we were trying to make in a visual format, in a type of artwork that people would look at on first glance and see it, perhaps in this case, as a kind of integrated cityscape, and then focus into the different points of view of the recommendations. And I really like this example, which is coupled with a longer narrative that is about a half a page long, and the map itself in a summary document. Because what this does is it takes the visual tensions of what artists experience in terms of, if you look at all the way to the left, you'll see there's a character in which they've got the sound off and the sound on, and this idea that you can speak or you cannot speak, or where your voice is. We've got the way in which the role of democracy features around voting, and a kind of critique that the artist is making of insecurity that happens in many African countries that claim to be democracies, but that don't uphold freedom of expression that would protect artists. And to also integrate it into this cityscape recognizes that these issues and the points of view that we're trying to impart are embedded in a whole large social network. And that was one of the real findings of the research, that might not necessarily be a policy recommendation, but something that we're able to visualize, which is people are networked, and artists and allied activists are using forms of solidarity as their strategies for safety. And in the absence of being able to have a temporary shelter or relocation program, or even in the case of South Sudan, where we're working, not a single safe house for someone to be protected in, people are relying on each other and looking to each other. And this visualization also recognizes that a lot of what's happening for creatives who are experiencing chronic insecurity and who are threatened and whose rights to freedom of expression and safety are being violated are living in cities and are moving to other cities. And so it's very much an urban phenomenon that we're working in this instance. And so that urban infrastructure and the setting of this, could it be Nairobi, or could it be Kampala, or could it be Cape Town, also brings in somewhat of a familiarity that artists who are looking at this work can resonate with. But it geolocates it in such a way that it's not essentializing some sort of African experience. You don't see in this image people being beaten or suffering. You don't see in this image degraded settings. You don't see in this image anyone walking around with a jerry can or a basket on their head that becomes a kind of African essentialist image. So again, to reiterate, by working with artists who are in the context, we're able to do a larger project of reframing the representation and being able to not just impart knowledge to policymakers, but to do it in such a way that we're subtly also changing the landscape of representation in a context of humanitarianism, in a context of Euro-American-led support for asylum and temporary shelter and relocation that still, unfortunately, tends to reduce images of African people in need to a particular perspective of suffering. And so I think that's part of a kind of larger agenda of what we're able to do from the creative point of view, and why I would encourage people to think about the policy briefs and the recommendations as a conjoined creative effort to reframe those issues as well. So I'm going to stop sharing there and share some links, answer some questions, and hopefully talk to you more about what you might be interested in terms of your own policy recommendations or questions about how we impart knowledge in this creative way.
Thank you so much, Kara. That was really great. It was super interesting and nice to kind of see these slides as well, visualize exactly what you're talking about. Does anyone have any questions? Want to kind of ask the first question? Oh, Barrett.
I don't have to ask the first question, but I do have a question. And my question is, how did these different elements that you talked us through, how did they come together in your visual policy brief, and who was your audience for that? Who did you, and maybe also what kind of reactions did you get from the audience? So who was this for, and what kind of happened, so to speak?
Yeah, so the policy briefs are often accompanied by larger, more extensive reports, and so they're the kind of quick snapshot. And this particular research was for people who were supporting temporary shelter and relocation programs for diplomatic funds that were invested in supporting asylum and relocation of people affected by violations on freedom of expression, people who are human rights defenders and cultural rights defenders. And in part, it was slightly a response to the notion that when people need protection, they often go to the closest locality, that the European or North American destination in the context of African or Latin American cases is not the first port of call. And so we wanted to map out for those agencies somewhat a sense of, well, what are people actually doing here, and what does the landscape look like across the continent that's actually supporting the relocation. And we found that it's been quite useful for those organizations, also because in the rise of temporary shelter and relocations, as with many humanitarian efforts, there can be competition between them, and this narrative that, oh, well, we need to have this thing because this doesn't exist, and whether it's a support for a shelter city in The Hague, or the Artists at Risk Connection, or Artists at Risk, which is another organization, or Safe Muse, or, and so there's an effort for funding that tends to think about their work in isolation. So the mapping was a way to kind of bring that together and to also inform the diplomatic funding that is supporting this type of work. And so we've seen that it's led to more interesting work around that and more connected, conjoined approaches. And then the usefulness for artists as a protection tool was also one of the aims, is that by mapping these things out and understanding what exists where, then people can practically use it for their own safety. And in the longer report, we've included a series of resources for people to use. So those are kind of the two audiences that we were targeting with it, although quite different audiences. And I think it's been quite well received. I've seen the work circulated, and I found, now having done a few different types of these creative policy briefs and creative responses to larger bodies of research, that it's often the things that people go to, and it becomes a stronger archival presence than the long reports that can often be published or printed and then not gone back to, because the brevity of it, the creativity of it, somehow sits with people in their mind. They remember the image, they remember the map, and they go back to that.
Perfect, thanks. Does anyone else have any questions? And please do ask questions in Spanish too. Yes.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you so much for this fascinating work that you are doing. And my name is Michiko Kuroda. I'm doing some research on protection of civilians in UN peacekeeping operations. And you mentioned that artists are not covered by the Geneva Convention or UN peacekeeping kind of operation. Can you please clarify what do you mean, and explain more about it? I'm just a little bit concerned about what you said. So
yeah, so it relates to the protection of cultural heritage and cultural property, which is quite clearly enshrined. And that is the context in which peacekeepers and humanitarians are trained in their missions. And so when it comes to protection of artists, although freedom of expression is part of human rights, there's not the same rights framework that's being trained and into people who might be there to identify the risk and the threat. And the move towards cultural rights doesn't have much implementation power. And so although there's been work to language what this form of rights means, it hasn't really been domesticated, for want of a better word, from signatories to the various conventions and to member states. And so that has been the protection gap that we see. And then also the issue comes is that within the support of human rights defenders or journalists, which is usually where freedom of expression support comes in, artists are not always understood within that category. And we see some support for cartoonists because they are much like journalists and publish in newspapers. And so there's a certain kind of evidence around what their artwork does and what their threat or risk would be. But for other artists who are involved in social movements, that's not really the case. And so the support that they need for relocation and specific protections and even accompaniment. I mean, you know, we're talking in the context of unarmed civilian protection, in which accompaniment is one of the strategies that's used. Often artists will create that within their own safety networks, but are not offered that by protection organizations because they're not understood as being under threat or at risk in the same way as other types of activists. And artists don't always identify as activists as well. Is the other point, is that there's a language around the protection that artists don't always use and therefore aren't protected because they're not enrolled into that language.
Wow. Well, thank you so much. It's very interesting. I'm just wondering if you have any text-based report on that.
Yeah, I do. We've got a special issue of the Journal of Global Policy coming out on the Sudan work. So I've got a piece in that, but I'm trying to write a creative policy brief. And that's
okay.
why.
Okay.
But if you send me your email and I can forward you some of that content.
Oh, thank you so much. Can I share it in the chat box or
Yeah, sure.
send it? Oh, thank you so much.
Also, Kara, if you want to, if you're happy for us to share it with everyone in this meeting, if you just send it to Louise and she can send it out to everybody who's registered here, then we can have a look.
Sure.
Yeah, that would be really great. Thanks. Okay, we have a question from Astrid, I think.
Buenos días para todos y para todas.
Good day, everybody. Greetings from Colombia. We really thank this space. It's very valuable. And the talk today was very interesting. Kara's research was very interesting. I would like to ask Kara, can you speak a little bit more about creative research in Colombia? And what have been the different measures and practices of self-protection that you have found to work around risks to artists?
Thank you so much for your question. I will respond in English. I hope that's okay, and you'll get the translation. In terms of the creative methods, one of the things that I do is I commission artworks. So I work with artists where we make artworks together and then make exhibitions to propose the details of the research or the commission collaboration to an audience. And then that helps to inform the outcomes of the work that we're doing and the value of it. Currently, we're working with a Colombian artist called Manuela Laura, who is in Bogota. And she is working with some groups of people who are using self-protection strategies to stay safe, and making portraits. So that's one of her ways of doing it, is through portraiture and photography, and then also through materials. So thinking about how the materials of in the project she did Vivas with social leaders, the women whose portraits were made were then asked to identify a material that represented themselves. And then they made paper from that material. So that could be maize or wool or chontaduro in one case. And so that is a component of it. Now, next week, we've actually got a session with her where she's going to be talking about that work, and the new work that she's doing. And one of the questions we have for our participants is about objects of safety and materials of safety. And so through that object-based work, we're able to understand forms of protection. And there's another artist we're working with who's done a 7-year series called Objetos de Paz. And she's worked with people to think about peace through the different objects. And so now we're taking that same point of view and looking at it from protection. Now, the accompaniment is one way in which people seek safety or self-protect. The other thing that we find with our research is through residencies, through artistic residencies. So artists will then go to residency spaces and be able to have that as a form of safety. And that can be within the country, but oftentimes outside of the country. So international residencies are a useful place for that. And cybersecurity, I think, is one form of self-protection that people are using, because a lot of the way that they're sharing their artwork these days, especially for younger generations, is online. And so being able to protect themselves and their computers and to protect themselves from cyber threats. And also because cyber attacks and cyber bullying is an indicator of an early stage of risk that can escalate into other forms of violence. So I would say those are a few that we're finding at the moment.
Thank you, Kara and Astrid, for again, super interesting question. We have a few minutes left, so probably time for just one more question, maybe two, which is lucky because we have one more hand up. So Claudia, do you want to ask your question? Thanks.
Hi, Kara, thank you so much for that. Really inspiring. And I agree with you, aesthetics matter. And this is something that I'm trying to do in my work as well. I have a more mundane question. Oh, and before I want to say that I really like what you said about the danger of trying to portray or essentialize the body in pain, and just to be mindful about that. My question is, as a beginner, when you're trying to put a bid together, how do you, what's the percentage of how does it work in terms of recruiting the artist? How do you account for this in an initial bid, for example, if I have no experience of doing this? Thank you.
As we've just got a couple of minutes left, Kara, would you like to take Juan Mario's question too and then address them both together? Is that okay?
Sure, yeah.
Let's do that. Juan, would you like to tell us your question too? Okay, I'm not sure if we're having some internet issues, maybe. So let's just go with Claudia's question for now, and then we can circle back if we have time.
Yeah, thank you, Claudia. Practicalities are so important, and paying artists for their time is also so important. So I think if you're putting together a research project, being able to cost for either licensing of images is helpful. So, you know, in the fuller reports that we do, we often will license some image, and that's a starting point, is to just integrate visuals into your reporting. And academic journals often charge to publish images as well. So costing for that, or if you're in a university, which it looks like you're in Plymouth, seeing if your library will pay for the use of images in your journal articles. And I mean, you can pay anywhere from, say, £50 or €50 for an use of an image. Whereas if you're commissioning something, then you might spend a couple of days on it. And so you would cost someone's time per day like you would a consultant. So being able to do those commissioned type works, I think you're looking at maybe 2 to 3 days of time. The map is a little bit more technical, and because we work with stakeholders too, there's a little bit of reviewing and backstopping. So sometimes that takes a little bit more time. And in terms of recruiting artists, I often do it through networks, through social media, and you can get a couple of quotes and different ideas from people, and then go from there. And so I think that's a good place to start. And I think then you also need to allocate your own time, and how much time would it take for you or your project to then work with that artist to realize the outcome that you want. So if you think about it in a way like an editor or a contributor to the outputs that you would already create, but it's just a creative point of view. But I find the best way to work with artists is actually collaborate with them. And one thing that's, I'm just going to plug the Network Plus, but one thing that's great about this particular support for funding is that, you know, we can have artists in the bids, named on the bids, who are supported adequately. So I think it's also about, if you can find a funding option that would allow you to work with an artist from the start, because then you can even get your logo made by an artist, or, you know, something designed well for promoting the work that you do, or some things that are even sort of minor, but then create a visual language around the project that is so valuable.
Thank you, Kara. Just good question. Sorry, what was the link to the network, please? Thank you.
I'll put it in the chat.
Thanks. I'm going to quickly just try to unmute Juan from my end, just to see if you can ask a quick question. But I think...
Or you can write it, the question, in the chat, Juan.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not able to do it from my side. If not, you can also kind of follow up after this if you would like, because I think we are kind of out of time now anyway. Oh, thanks. Yeah, so Kara's email is in the chat now. But thank you so much for this, Kara. It was really interesting. Oh no, we do have a very quick question here. I can just read it out from Juan Mario. Did your project allow for exploring the relationship between artists and communities?
Yeah, definitely. And most of the work that we do is connected to that. And we work what we would call like socially engaged artists. So these are artists whose artworks are in reference to social and political issues. And if you want to know more about communities in particular related to the project we're doing now in Colombia and South Sudan, we can share some details with you on that. I know one of our co-investigators at Universidad de los Andes is working with collectives and organizations. So the case studies that he's doing is from an organizational point of view. And so he's working with an Afro-Caribbean museum that had to close because of threats that they faced, and another community organization called Caribe Afirmativo. So yeah, that's a way in which organizations and communities are working together.
Thank you. Okay, I think we are really out of time this time, but thank you so much, Kara. I think these insights into kind of art as research, but also really preserving that creativity in the reporting process is so important because it so often just gets lost. So thank you so much for coming to speak to us, and thank you too to Catalina for interpreting as well. And yeah, hopefully we'll see some visual policy briefs in the Network Plus soon. It would be nice to read them, I think. And we'll share this recording